All right, good afternoon, boys and girls. A little late, 13 minutes late today. I was getting lunch done around the house and feeding my kids and washing dishes, and then I said, "Oh, I forgot Mr. Popper's penguins." So, sorry about being a little late if you're waiting for me. Um, Hopefully, you're able to get your work done today. So far today, you should have 15 minutes of iReady Path. You should have read a book either through Epic, a book from home, or an online novel from the online list of novels you can read. And then do your story elements Google slide. And then also you had your spelling city word work. I had a couple people say that it wasn't working or something froze on it. It's quite possible. I'm not really sure what it is on their end. But if that does happen, no big deal. And then you also had a Kahoot on commas, and I did it too. And nobody beat my score, I don't think. I have to go back and check, but so far I'm in first place. So make sure you do your commas assignment for Kahoot as well. And that was it. Make sure you check your writing from last week, your research writing, and make sure that you check any comments that I left you to make changes to your writing. Tomorrow at 1 o'clock, I'm going to pull a few students and conference with them from time to time tomorrow, throughout the day, actually. And I want to make sure that you correct your writing because we're moving on to narrative writing once I am done, finished conferencing with all your day is good. And when we left Mr. Popper's Penguins yesterday, it was chapter 17, I believe. And we found out that they went to a theater, but it was the wrong theater. And they showed up, and there was an act that had seals, and there was much commotion. And actually, the penguins and the seals got along, but the owner of the act that did the seals was not happy because it messed up the act, and the owner of the theater was not happy because the penguins were not supposed to be there. So I think they called the cops on them actually at the end of the chapter. So actually, I want to find out what happened because hopefully they don't get in trouble with what happened at the end of the chapter. Actually, we're on chapter 19, aren't we? So I forgot to show you some pictures from yesterday, but the penguins were dressed up as firemen, and then the seals were dressed up as policemen, and it looks like they had a good old time having fun together, but they did get in trouble. So towards the end of the chapter, we found out that they are at the wrong theater. They went to the Royal Theater, not the Regal Theater. So let's see what happens. Hopefully they're not in too much trouble. So this is chapter 19, not chapter 18. Admiral Drake. So if you can remember who Admiral Drake was, he was the admiral that sent the penguins from the South Pole to Mr. Popper in the beginning of the book. So Mr. Popper, with Captain Cook, Greta, Columbus, Louisa, Nelson, Jenny, Magellan, Adelina, Scoot, Isabella, Ferdinand, and Victoria, was bundled into the patrol wagon and hustled off to the police station. So I guess they did get in trouble. None of his pleas could move the desk sergeant. That theater manager is pretty mad at the way you busted into his theater, so I'm holding you. I'm going to give you all a nice quiet cell unless you furnish bail. I'm putting the bail at $500 for you and $100 for each of the birds. So let's see, 500, and then there's 12 birds. So 500 plus 1,200 is $1,700 they had to come up with. Of course, Mr. Popper did not have that much money about him. Neither did Mrs. Popper when they telephoned her at the hotel. The hotel bill was paid for several days ahead, but she had no cash. The check for the final week's salary was not due until the end of the week. Indeed, it now looked as if the Poppers would never see that check, since they could not get the penguins out of jail long enough to put on their act at the Royal Theater. If only they could have gotten in touch with Mr. Greenbaum, Mr. Palmer knew that kind man would have. Yeah, I'm going to start that one over. If only they could have got in touch with Mr. Greenbaum. Mr. Popper knew that kind man would have gotten them out. But Mr. Greenbaum was somewhere in Hollywood, out on the Pacific coast, and the Poppers had no idea how to reach him. It was very dull for the birds in jail. Wednesday came, and there was still no word from Mr. Greenbaum. Thursday, and the birds began to droop. It was soon apparent that the lack of exercise, combined with the heat, might prove too much for them. There were no more tricks or merry games. Even the younger birds, that's them in jail, even the younger ones sat all day in dismal silence, and Mr. Popper could not cheer them up. Mr. Popper had a feeling that Mr. Greenbaum would probably turn up by the end of the week to see about renewing the contract, but Friday passed without any news of him. Saturday morning, Mr. Popper got up very early and smoothed his hair. Then he dusted off the penguins as well as he could, for he wanted everything to look as presentable as possible in case Mr. Greenbaum should appear. About 10 o'clock, there was a sound of footsteps in the corridor and a jingling of keys, and the door of the cell was opened. "You're free, Mr. Popper. There's a friend of yours here." Mr. Popper stepped out into the light with the penguins. "You're barely in time, Mr. Greenbaum," he was about to say. Then, as his eyes became accustomed to the lights, he looked again. It was not Mr. Greenbaum who stood there. It was a great bearded man in a splendid uniform. Smiling, he held out his hand to Mr. Popper. "Mr. Popper," he said, "I am Admiral Drake." "Admiral Drake," gasped Mr. Popper. "Not back from the South Pole?" "Yes," said the Admiral. "The Drake Antarctic expedition ship returned yesterday. You should have seen the reception New York gave us. You can read about it in today's paper. But I read about the trouble you are having over the penguins, and so here I am. I have a long story to tell you." "Could we go to the hotel and talk about it?" asked Mr. Popper. "My wife will be anxious to see us back." "Certainly," said the Admiral. And when they were all settled in the Popper rooms at the hotel, with the penguins clustering round to listen, Admiral Drake began. "Naturally, when I knew I was coming back to America, I often thought about the man to whom I sent the penguin. It takes us a long time to hear things down there, and I often wondered how you and the bird were getting along. Last night at the mayor's dinner for us, I heard about the wonderful trained penguin act you have been putting on all over the country. This morning I picked up the paper, and the first thing I read was that Mr. Popper and his 12 penguins were still being held in jail." "But 12 penguins, Mr. Popper? How on earth?" Then Mr. Popper told how Greta had arrived to keep Captain Cook from being lonely, and how the little penguins had grown, and how the clever little band had saved the day for the Poppers when things looked bad. "It's amazing," said Admiral Drake. "I've seen a lot of penguins in my time, but never such educated ones as these. It certainly shows what patience and training can do. But now, to get to my real point, Mr. Popper, you probably know that I have explored the North Pole as well as the South Pole." "Oh, yes," said Mr. Popper respectfully. "I have read books about your Arctic and Antarctic expeditions." "Well, then," said the Admiral, "maybe you know why we explorers prefer the South Pole." "Could it be on the account of the penguins, sir?" asked Janie, who had been listening very hard. Admiral Drake patted her head. "Yes, my dear. Those long polar nights get pretty dull when you have no pets to play with. Of course there are polar bears up there, but you can't play with them. Nobody knows why there are no penguins at the North Pole. For a long time the United States government has been wanting me to lead an expedition up there for the purpose of establishing a breed of penguins. I must come to the point, Mr. Popper. You've had such a remarkable success with these birds of yours. Why not let me take them to the North Pole and start a race of penguins there?" Just then Mr. Greenbaum and another gentleman were announced. They shook hands all around and were introduced to the Admiral. "Well, Popper," said Mr. Greenbaum, "too bad about that mix-up over the theaters, but never mind. Here's Mr. Klein, who owns the Colossal Film Company. He's going to make your fortune. You'll be a poor man no longer, Mr. Popper." Poor, said Mr. Popper. I'm not poor. These birds have been earning us $5,000 a week. Oh, $5,000, said Mr. Klein. What's that? Pin money. I want to put those birds in the movies, Mr. Popper. We've got the story department working on stories for them already. Why, I'll put each of those birds under a contract that will keep you and the missus on Easy Street the rest of your lives. Papa, whispered Mrs. Popper, I don't want to live on Easy Street. I want to go back to Proudfoot Avenue. Better consider, Mr. Popper, said the Admiral. I can't offer you anything like that. You say those men at the North Pole get lonely because there are no penguins? Asked Mr. Popper. Very lonely, said the Admiral. But if there were penguins up there, might the polar bears eat them? Oh, ordinary penguins, yes, said the Admiral judiciously, but not such highly trained birds as yours, Mr. Popper. They could outwit any polar bear, I guess. It was now Mr. Klein's turn to speak. In every morning picture house in America, little children would have the pleasure of seeing stories acted by Popper's performing penguins, he said. Of course, if we succeeded in establishing the breed of the North Pole, said the Admiral, the name might have to be changed a little. I imagine the hundreds of years from now, scientists would be calling them the Popper Arctic penguins. Mr. Popper was silent for a moment. Gentlemen, he said, I want to thank you both. I'll give you my decision tomorrow. Chapter 20 is called Farewell, Mr. Popper. That sounds like a hard decision to make. Knowing Mr. Popper, so he has two choices. He can take the money and get a movie deal for the penguins and get lots of money and be happy and, have a successful rest of his life, probably making money off the penguins. Or his second option is for Admiral Drake to take the penguins to the North Pole, and he will be recognized for, getting a colony of penguins up to the North Pole for the first time. They'd probably be named Popper's Arctic penguins, so he'd be getting recognized for that. And he would keep, explorers in the North Pole. They could be, pets and something else that they could use and not be lonely up in the North Pole. But he could make lots of money as well. So what would you do? I think most of you would probably sell the rights to the penguins and make movies and make a lot of money and live comfortably. And so I would have to seriously think about that. But remember, Mr. Popper is a different kind of breed of a person. I think he's a little different. He might be thinking what's the best for the penguins, and probably the best for the penguins is to maybe try and colonize the North Pole. Then again, he might have another decision to keep the penguins for himself and go back to his life in his town and in his house. So I don't know. That's going to be a good. I'm going to kind of look forward to. I won't do this on Wednesday, but Thursday we'll find out what his decision is, and that should be a good decision to wait for. So I can't wait. I want to read. I want to read more to find out what the decision is on what he decides. But next chapter is called Farewell, Mr. Popper. That makes me think that either way, the penguins could be leaving Mr. Popper. So, all right. I hope you enjoyed the read aloud, and we're getting close to the end of the story. I think there's only a couple more chapters left. So maybe by Friday, we might be finished the story. All right. I hope you guys are having a good day. If you have any questions or assignments, make sure you email me or private message me through Google Classroom. And I'll see you, some of you, tomorrow. We will have morning meeting at 8:30. And remember, tomorrow is a makeup day, so any work that hasn't been complete from Thursday, Friday, Monday, or Tuesday, you're completing on Wednesday. And some of you, I will be meeting with a Google Meets for your writing to get you back on track and to make some revisions to your animal research writing. All right, hopefully everybody's having a good day, and I'll see some of you tomorrow.